Hello, and welcome back to Off the Deaton Path. I'm your host, Stan Deaton, with the Georgia Historical Society, and we welcome you to this podcast for the week of July 3rd, 2025. We are coming to you this week from the Summer Reading Division here at the Georgia Historical Society on the 15th floor of the Jepson House, overlooking beautiful Forsyth Park in downtown Savannah. This is the first episode of our 9th season here at Off the Deaton Path, and I'm delighted to have you back and appreciate all those who have listened and supported and liked and shared and sent in comments. All those who have supported this podcast over the years, going all the way back to the first one on August 25th, 2017, when I had no idea what I was doing. When I sat down with a recorder in front of me and started talking about a biography of Hitler that I was reading. I'm taking a hiatus from interviewing authors about their books that I've been doing for most of this 8th season this past year. Thought I would take a break from that over the summer. I'll pick that up again in the fall, and hopefully we'll continue to produce those podcasts. We will continue to produce this podcast, I hope on the same schedule every other week across the summer, despite the popular widespread clamor to please shut them down. I will not be interviewing authors, but I will be, I hope, interviewing some other folks to talk about some interesting things, be it books or sports, history, whatever it is, subjects of my choosing. And you can listen or don't. I appreciate that if you want to listen. And we'll be sharing some of those things as we go across the summer. Now, if you listened to my podcast back in December when I talked about what I had read for the year, a year of reading, one of the things that I talked about was lamenting the fact that there were a whole host of books that I always have on my reading list every year and somehow never get to. So when summer got here and I wasn't going to be reading for this podcast, when the whole world of reading was open to me, I thought now's the time to dig into some of those books. But so far, that hasn't happened. Since I stopped reading for the podcast a month or so ago, I've been reading novels. I've read 6 novels so far. So I thought part of what I want to do today is just share those with you, some of what I'm reading, hear about what you might be reading over the summer. I didn't really set out to read 6 novels, but a couple of years ago, I started down the path of reading the first volume of a trilogy in several series, and so I finally got back this summer to reading the second volume in some of those series. So let's jump right in and talk about these. The first one is a novel by Nina Stibbe, who is a British author. She's 63 years old. Her rise came a couple of years ago when she wrote a memoir called Love, Nina, about her time working as a nanny for a literary family in England, in London, I think, and she wrote letters home to her sister, and that became the basis for this book. Well, in 2014, she published a book called Man at the Helm, which was a novel about a young girl who's trying to find a husband for her mother. Her mother is quite a character. So I read Men at the Helm a couple of years ago. It's semi-autobiographical, and the young girl in that book is named Lizzie Vogel. So the second volume that I read first this summer was called Paradise Lost. Paradise Lost, my goodness, that's not it. It's Paradise Lodge, which is the name of a fictional retirement home that Lizzie is working in now that she is a teenager. She's grown up a little bit since the first book. But these books are enormously funny. They're quite moving in places. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I'm going to move on probably next summer and read the third volume in this trilogy. Again, Men at the Helm was published in 2014. Paradise Lodge is the second volume, published in 2016. I thoroughly enjoyed both of these books and look forward to moving on to volume 3. The second book that I read was also written by a British woman. This was Jane Gardam. The second volume in her Old Filth trilogy. Jane Gardam died just recently, April 28th of this year, 2025, at age 96. As I mentioned, she was British also. The first volume in the Old Filth trilogy is also called Old Filth, and it's about a lawyer and judge, Sir Edward Feathers, and he's called Filth, not because he was himself filthy, but because Filth stood for Failed in London, Try Hong Kong. And that first book, which I read a couple of years ago, was his memoirs, fictional, of course, looking back over a life in his legal career. He's been recently widowed. His wife, Betty, died. The second volume, which I just read this summer, was called The Man in the Wooden Hat, published in 2009, and it picks up sort of the story, doesn't pick it up, but it goes back over much of the same ground covered in volume one, but this time from the viewpoint of Filth's wife, Betty Feathers. And it was quite interesting, quite a good read. And the third volume, whose name escapes me now, but I'll probably read that next year. So Jane Gardam, also highly recommended, a towering writer, really good fiction. Again, this one was recommended to me some years ago, and I thoroughly enjoyed reading both the books in this series. The third book that I read was a little bit newer in terms of when it was published. Also published, written by a woman. This was To and Fro by Leah Hager Cohen. It was published on May 21st of last year. This is a very interesting book, not least of which is the way that the whole thing is put together. This is this is a story told in mirrored narratives. It's one of these books that you can start reading from either end. You can flip the book upside down and read. You can go to or fro. The book was reviewed in the Washington Post on May 21st of this year by Wendy Smith. And I just want to read a couple of paragraphs because it describes much better than I could exactly what's going on in this book. First of all, she describes it as a literary jewel with multiple facets. Its two storylines form a satisfying jigsaw puzzle of cleverly interlocking parts. Yet these separate narratives, each following a young girl in search of something she can't quite define, are also profoundly mysterious, charged with the conviction that many aspects of life cannot and should not be explained. Cohen sends both her protagonists on odysseys that lead not to conclusions, but to, quote, two beginnings and no end. That is the title of the exultant final chapter, printed in two columns at the center of this unusually formatted book. As Cohen describes it in an author's note, it is, quote, a volume whose twin parts are printed upside down to each other, beginning at either end of the book to meet in the middle, unquote. Readers may begin with either to or fro. Each opens with an invitation that instructs them to start here or flip it around. The digital version of the novel allows readers to choose either portion by clicking a link, but its more conventional linear progression lacks the elan of the print edition. Reaching the final chapter at the book's center, where two moving denouements share space side by side, is a unique experience that can't be had in an ebook. This is a text you want to hold in your hands, unquote. So it's a very interesting book. Again, follows the odyssey of two young girls with different names, but they meet in the stories sort of meet and end at the same place. Another book that was recommended to me I started on the fro side because that side was blue. The color blue attracted me. I started there, could just as easily have started on the other side. If I had started on the two side, I don't think I would have enjoyed the book as much as I did when I got through. It's a very interesting approach to writing a novel. And of course, novels do many things. I enjoy them because they take different approaches to all of which trying to understand a basic question about trying to understand who we are as humans. And there's something about the three books that I've mentioned that I read, Paradise Lodge, The Man in the Wooden Hat, and To and Fro, are all trying to get at some aspect of the human condition. And Leah Hager Cohen has taken a very unique approach to that. I recommend this book to you. You might enjoy it. You can start To or Fro, but there just aren't many books like this. So take a look. It was just published last year. The fourth book I read was Returning to an Old Friend. It's a book I've read at least 5 times. I tend to read it every year. It's a very quick read for me, no more than an hour or two at best. This is, of course, 84 Charing Cross Road by Helene Hanff. It was first published in 1960, and it's an epistolary memoir. And it's composed of letters from the 20-year correspondence between Helene Hanff and her quest to acquire books, good books to read, from the booksellers Marks and Cohen. Marks and Co., an antiquarian bookseller in London. Usually she was corresponding with a fellow who worked there in London named Frank Dowell. This is an all true story. And so it's really just a series of letters, usually very short and to the point, but quite entertaining, sometimes funny, sometimes sad. This was adapted into a 1975 television play, a 1976 radio drama, a 1981 stage play, and finally a 1987 film starring Anne Bancroft and Anthony Hopkins. And I just enjoy this book. It's something I usually take with me uh, when I go to the mountains in the summer. I just like to read it one morning. I'll pick it up and read all the way through it to the end. And it's if you love books and people and reading about people who love books, you will love 84 Charing Cross Road. By the way, the address, of course, was the name of the book. The title of the book comes from the address of the bookstore in London, where she addressed all these letters across 20 some odd years. The bookstore itself closed in December 1970, and what I read recently is that it now the building is still there and houses part of a McDonald's, which is quite tragic and quite sad and really is not worth dwelling on. But my goodness, it's a great book. The fifth book that I read also is a book I have read and reread, and I love it. I plan to read it every summer, if not more than that. This is the 1933 novel written by James Hilton, who's also British. Um, all the books today that I'm talking about seem to have either been written by a Brit or have something to do with Britain. This one was published in 1933. It's called Lost Horizon. It was made into a film in 1937, directed by the legendary Frank Capra, and believe it or not, a musical remake in 1973 with music by Burt Bacharach. I've never seen that. I watched the film, a 1937 film, recently recorded it again and started to watch it, but I realized that there's quite a bit of it that has been changed in the book itself, and I will not get into it. Rather, despite the fact it's not a terribly long read, you can get through it in a couple of days if you stay at it. Um, but and let me start by saying James Hilton, probably most famous as the writer of Goodbye, Mr. Chips, which was published in 1934. He also published Random Harvest in 1941. Lost Horizon, if you've ever heard the term Shangri-La as a term for any earthly paradise, really, it came from this book, Lost Horizon. And essentially, it's about four people who are trying to get out of a war-torn country. Um, they get on a plane thinking they're headed back to London or someplace like that in the somewhere in the British Empire. The plane is actually hijacked and they are kidnapped and taken to this remote, mysterious place in the mountains of Tibet, and they wind up in a place called Shangri-La, which is run by a lamasery, by monks. It's a mysterious place where people don't seem to age. The High Lama there ends up being about 250 years old. The star of the book, the hero of the book, is a man who is formed by the British Empire. He's 37 years old. His name is Hugh Conway. He's known as Glory Conway. And I don't quite know how to describe what it is about this book that I love reading. I think it's probably the description of what it's like at Shangri-La itself. I won't spoil any of it for you. I won't give any of it away. But this is a book that I return to year after year after year. I first was discovered this book through an Easton Press edition that I received some 15 years ago. I read it there. I read a version of it published in a trilogy, the great trilogy of books that I mentioned earlier that Hilton published. I read it there last summer. I read a paperback version this summer, which was which was a tribute to the fact that Lost Horizon was one of the first books published and mass marketed as a paperback in the 1930s. So I read the paperback edition, and I have discovered another edition when I was book shopping recently and bought it, and will probably read that version next year. It's a book that I will keep going back to. It just speaks to me on so many different levels. Now, I would say in relation to history, Shangri-La became kind of synonymous with any earthly paradise, as I mentioned. When a presidential retreat was built in 1935, well, actually, it wasn't built as a presidential retreat. I'm talking about Camp David, of course. FDR sort of appropriated a retreat that was built in the Catoctin Mountains of Frederick County, Maryland, about 62 miles northwest of Washington, D.C., It was built originally for federal agents, federal government agents and their families. It was completed in 1938 by the Works Progress Administration, and in 1942, FDR converted it into a retreat for the president and his family and his guests. And he called it Shangri-La. It was originally called High Catoctin. That's Hi hyphen and then Catoctin, named after the mountains. As I mentioned, it's located in on 125 acres in Catoctin Mountain Park in Frederick County, Maryland. And FDR called it Shangri-La because of this novel, which I think was one of the ones he enjoyed, one of his favorites. Um, it was later named Camp David, which isn't nearly as fun, by the way, by Dwight Eisenhower in 1953 in honor of his father and grandson, both of whom were named David, as was Dwight David Eisenhower himself. So, kind of a fun side note to Shangri-La. But Lost Horizon is a novel that just speaks to me on so many different levels. I enjoy it tremendously. I could probably read it and reread it and reread it over and over and not read anything else. But it's a book I return to every summer. So that was the fifth novel that I read this year. Highly recommended by me and enjoyed it. The sixth novel and current reading is called When All the World Was Young, published in 1992 by Dr. Ferrol Sams. If you're familiar with Ferrol Sams, he's a Georgia author. He's in the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame. This is the third book in his semi-autobiographical trilogy that began with Run with the Horseman in 1982, published when Dr. Sams was 60 years old. First novel, first book he ever wrote when he was 60, followed up by The Whisper of the River, published in 1985, and then this final volume published in 1992. And it follows the exploits of a young man called Porter Osborne Jr., of course, based on Ferrol Sams Jr., who grew up. He grew up in Fayette County, Georgia, southwest of Atlanta, in the 1920s and 30s. This book, When All the World Was Young, carries him through medical school at Emory and into service in World War II. And I got to tell you, Ferrol Sams is one of the funniest writers I've ever read. His books remind me, this book in particular reminds me of a Dickens novel. He meets a lot of interesting characters along the way, as Dickens characters often did, but he brings them to life. As Shelby Foote once said, a great fiction writer, a great writer of fiction, has got to be able to make the characters that they create stand up, walk across a room, and cast a shadow. All the characters that Ferrol Sams creates for his protagonists to meet do that and do it very well. This book is by turns hilariously funny, sad, tragic. It will make you cry. It will make you laugh. I've enjoyed his books tremendously, and I regret that I never got a chance to meet this man. I would have loved to have had him on this podcast, and I think he would have agreed to do it. Dr. Sams died in 2013 at the age of 90 and is buried in the Woolsey Cemetery in Woolsey, Georgia, which, where the heck is that? It's in Fayette County, where he grew up with all of his family members. They're buried there as well. I've watched some interviews with him on YouTube that you can see, and he is every bit, seems to have been every bit as funny and kind and nice as he seems to be in his book. So that's what I've been reading so far this summer. These six novels, again, I didn't plan it that way. One thing just led to another. I jotted down a list of books I'd like to read over the summer. It's probably way, way, way too ambitious for the time I actually have to read this summer, but I'll try to get through it. I mentioned some of those books that I'd like to read. One of them is, of course, The Power Broker by Robert Caro, which is a gigantic book. If you drop it on your foot, it will break every toe on that foot and several foot bones as well. It's a huge book, but immensely readable, about Robert Moses, the power broker himself. I mentioned a book by Keith Thomas called Religion and the Decline of Magic, which was written in 1971. I've always wanted to read that book. And several others that I'm also working on are books in trilogies or multi-volume editions. I'd like to get back and read the second volume of Douglas Southall Freeman's R.E. Lee, about, of course, the great Confederate chieftain Robert E. Lee. I read the first volume a couple of years ago, enjoyed it very much. You know, I always thought that Freeman, great writer though he was wrote very sycophantically about Lee. He does not. He obviously admired Robert E. Lee a great deal. If you know anything about Freeman, you know that he did. But he does not this is not an uncritical biography at all. Beautifully written, and I thoroughly enjoyed the first volume. A couple of years ago, I read the first volume of Shelby Foote's Civil War trilogy and would like to get back to the second volume of that. This is a very big book. It covers the Battle of Gettysburg. It's the middle of the war. And also continuing Alan Nevin's great 8-volume Ordeal of the Union. I'd like to read volume 5. I've read the first 4 books that cover 1847 to 1861, right at the beginning of the conflict of the Civil War, and volume 5 picks that up, beginning with Bull Run, and will carry it on through. So there's a host of other books that I'd like to read as well. I don't know if I'll have time to do that this summer, but I hope so. I'm going to continue to read. So those are some of the things that I'm reading this summer. I look forward to hearing about anything you want to share about what you're reading, if there's a great novel you've read or a great book of nonfiction or biography, because there are zillions of books out there still to be read. I should probably hold any thoughts about what's been happening in the world of sports until I do a separate podcast for those long-suffering listeners who don't give a poop about sports, who don't want to listen to me talk about it. But I can't. At this point, we're almost halfway through the baseball season, and if you're a baseball fan living in Georgia, you know this has not been the Atlanta Braves' best season. They got off to an 0-7 start, a bad start to the season, lost the first 7 games, and have really not been able to dig ourselves out of that hole yet. If you follow baseball, you know last year, the year before last, in 2023, the Atlanta Braves had one of the great offensive seasons in Major League Baseball history. They put up numbers and scored runs at a tremendous rate. Everybody up and down the lineup, with maybe one exception, just hit for power, hit for average. It was great. What a wonderful season. That lasted about a month into last year's season in 2024, and then the Braves' bats went cold. I actually wrote a blog post about it, written like a missing persons ad that you would put in the paper. What in the world has happened to the Braves' offense? It's kind of has continued over into this year, and if anything, has gotten worse. We seem to get shut out at least once or twice every week. Our bats go cold. One night we score 10 runs, and then we struggle to put up any runs at all. Up and down the lineup, with very few exceptions, everybody is hitting poorly, especially Michael Harris, especially Ozzie Albies. It's painful to watch. Our best pitcher, Chris Sale, who won the Cy Young last year, currently is on the injured list because of a fractured rib cage. Who knows how long a thing like that can keep you out when you're a pitcher, because you rely upon that core part of your body. Spencer Strider has struggled coming back from surgery. He started out 0-5. He's won his last 3, but that's not the kind of season we expected from him. So it's been a struggle this year. It has not been fun to watch the Atlanta Braves, and I'm saying that from the perspective of having watched the horrendous teams of the late 70s and most of the 80s, really up until 1991, with 1 or 2 exceptions. So it's a long season. We've still got a ways to go. The Braves have a long road to hoe if they're going to make the playoffs this year. But we'll see. One of the people that I hope to have on this podcast who will join me over the summer and not be talking about books is Mark Bradley, who retired from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution earlier this year after 39 years at the AJC. He wrote about sports, and he and I had a wonderful conversation by telephone a few months ago. He agreed to join me on this podcast, and I would love to have him on here to talk about what's going on in Atlanta sports, not only the Braves, but of course the Falcons, what the outlook for them will be this next year after the draft, the Atlanta Hawks, who just came through the draft, who would like to get back in the mix, not only in the Eastern Conference, but really as a contender for an NBA title. So what's on the horizon for Georgia football and all the other things that I love about sports. So look forward to having Mark Bradley on this podcast very soon. Speaking of retired Atlanta Journal-Constitution writers, my old friend Jim Galloway, who appeared on this podcast a few years ago, recently has published in our very own Georgia Historical Quarterly, the summer edition, which will be out very soon now, here in the middle of 2025. He has the whole field to himself in this issue. Jim has been fascinated by the 1956 Georgia state flag change for some time now, and he's written two very, very good, penetrating articles about the 1956 flag change, the politics behind it, what it was really all about. Was it a reaction to Brown versus Board of Education, the 1954 landmark Supreme Court decision that ordered schools be desegregated? Was it that? What was it all about? Check it out. It's going to be in the summer 2025 issue of the Georgia Historical Quarterly, which will be out very soon, by our old friend Jim Galloway. Check it out. Well, that's all for now. I deeply appreciate you tuning in to Off the Deaton Path through 8 years as we launch into this 9th year. I hope I've got some very interesting programs coming up for you this year. Let me know what you're reading or what you'd like to hear on this podcast. Drop me a line at sdeaton@georgiahistory.com. That's SDEATON @georgiahistory. That's Georgia all spelled out in one word, georgiahistory.com. sdeaton@georgiahistory.com. I look forward to seeing you back on here very soon. The hardest working producer and engineer in show business, the producer of this podcast, as well as the czar of our Tallahassee office, is our very own and indispensable Brendan Cannonball Crellin. You can find our podcast anywhere you can find podcasts, including YouTube and YouTube Music. You can also find Off the Deaton Path on the podcast app on your phone, and I would ask you to please leave a review on the Apple Podcast app. That would be most appreciated and helpful. Be sure and like Off the Deaton Path on Facebook as well. Learn everything about the Georgia Historical Society at georgiahistory.com and the Georgia History Festival at georgiahistoryfestival.org. Please also visit the official Off the Deaton Path website at deatonpath.georgiahistory.com and check out my videos, my blog, and similar podcasts about great books that I'm reading and the authors who write them, like this one. Stay safe, stay strong. I'm Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society. As always, thank you for listening.